The name of the shiur tonight is Lo Vashamayim Hi, the immutability of Toras Moshe. Now, what does that mean? Normally, we associate Lo Vashamayim Hi with that famous story about the baskol, and that we don't listen to a baskol. But there's actually a more basic principle about Lo Vashamayim Hi. It's an excellent. I don't know. Does anyone have the set of Encyclopedia Talmudis? Did you get the newest edition? This is 33, Lama Gimel. So they have a great entry on Lo Vashamayim Hi. So I figured no one had seen it yet. I just got it. It's fresh off the press. So I was able to get a great set of Myra Makomos from the Encyclopedia Talmudis. We're familiar with the idea that we don't listen to a baskol. We don't listen to a heavenly voice dictate halacha to us. But it's actually more than that. There's a certain unchangeability of the Torah that was given to us to Moshe. And that's the reason why you can't listen to a baskol. Because a navi, whether it's through a baskol or through a nevuah, cannot add or subtract to the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. That the Torah that Moshe gave to us, that divinity is intact and it cannot be expanded and it cannot be detracted. That's the general idea of Lo Vashamayim Hi. It's based on the immutability of Torah. And we're going to see why that is, why Torah has to remain that way. And we're also going to be left with a number of challenges to that principle. The purpose of the shiur tonight is not to answer all of those challenges, but at least to try and get a little greater clarity about some of the inconsistencies to this principle of Lo Vashamayim Hi. When do we rely on Nevi'im to dictate halacha to us, and when do we not? So let's take a look. The first place we're going to start tonight, and this might be the first of a few parts, because we're not even going to touch on the Gemara in Bava Metzia about the baskol. So let's first look at the Gemara in Tumura Daf Tes Zayin Amud Aleph. Gufa Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Shloshes alofim halachos nishtakchu bimei evlo shel Moshe. There were 3,000 halachas that were forgotten on the day that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away. Amr lo li Yehoshua shal. So the Jews said to Yehoshua, go ask Hashem, because Yehoshua was a Navi. They said, go ask Hashem what the halacha is about these for any one of these three halachas. So Amar lahu lo vashamayim hi. So he said to them, sorry, once it's forgotten, once it's lost. We can't ask Hashem anymore. It's not in heaven. So Amar lo li Shmuel, later the Jewish people, when Shmuel was in charge, they said to him, Sha'al. Amar lahem, and he said back to them, Eile hamitzvos. The Torah says, these are the commandments, the last pasuk of the Torah. She'ein hanavi rishai l'chadesh davar me'ata. We see from those words, Eile hamitzvos. Eile is a mi'ut. It's an exclusionary clause. This teaches us that a Navi does not have the right to innovate any halacha. So I can't ask Hashem what the halacha is, because as a Navi, I cannot tell you what the halacha is from heaven. Now, the question obviously is, why did he not say Lo Vashamayim Hi? Why did he have to quote a different pasuk? So this is a good question. We'll take a look in a minute. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha says, Af chata sumesu be'aleha nishtakcha bimei evlo shel Moshe. And this is really the connection to Maseches Tumura, which talks about certain difficult situations with karbanos. That one of the halachos that was forgotten in the lifetime of when Moshe died was, what are you supposed to do when a person sets aside a korban chatas, a sin offering, and then he dies? What happens to that animal? Is the animal supposed to be brought as a korban? Is it supposed to graze until it develops a mum, and then you do something with the blemished animal? Or is he supposed to just trap it until it dies a natural death, starve it to death? Which ultimately is what the Gemara says you're supposed to do. The Gemara then continues and says, Amru lePinchas sha'al, Amr le lo bashamayim hi. They said to Pinchas.
Isn't that out of order?
It seems to be a little bit out of order, yeah. It seems Shmuel comes after. Pinchas is in the times of the Shoftim. And he says, Lo bashamayim hi. Amr lehu le'elazar sha'al, Amr lehem eila hamitzvah she'en navi rishai l'chadesh davar me'ata. Perhaps it's doing it in order to create this back and forth. One response is Lo bashamayim hi. The other response is Eile hamitzvos, a Navi cannot be Mechadish. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, B'shah sheniftar Moshe Rabbeinu l'Gan Eden, Amar lo li Yehoshua. So when Moshe was passing away, going up to Gan Eden, he says to Yehoshua, Sha'al mimenu kol sveikos sheyesh lach. Ask me any question that you have. This is your last chance. I'm taking a one-way ticket to Gan Eden. So this is your last chance to ask me any question you might have. So Amar lo Rabbi, klum hinachticha sha'echas v'halachti l'makom acher. So he said to him, Rabbi, I never left you alone for a minute. So everything that you've learned, I must have learned already. Lo kach kasaftabi, did you not write about me? Umisharso Yehoshua bin Nar lo yomish mitocha ohel. You yourself, Rabbi Moshe Rabbeinu, you wrote in your Torah that I am your attendant and I never left your side ever. So miyad tashash kocho shel Yehoshua v'nishtakchu mimenu shalosh meos halachos. That at that moment Yehoshua became weak and he forgot 300 halachos. It seems like this is a slightly different version of the previous Gemara because it says Shloshes Alafim halachos, that there were 3,000 halachos, or perhaps it's not a conflict and Yehoshua had some and other people had others. It's not really clear. But as the Meforshim point out, it was Yehoshua's hubris for thinking that he had it all. So he says, no, it's okay, Rebbe, I'm good. You can go to Gan Eden now. Right? So that was the punishment. When a person has that sense of hubris, he forgets Torah. And a new 700 questions arose in his mind about halacha. V'amdu kol Yisrael lahargo. And the Jews wanted to kill him. They said, listen, you're the new leader, and you don't know all of these halachas that we have endowed. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, lomar lacha efshar. So Hashem says, I can't tell you directly, because the Torah is not in heaven. And therefore, I can't tell you what the answer to these shilas are. Leich v'tortnu b'milchama. So if you want to get the Jews off your back, go take them out to war. This is basically a tactic, a political tactic. If the people are restless, make a war. So it'll take their mind off of the internal unrest, and they'll fight an external enemy, which is a very strange thing. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu obviously had an agenda for Milchama, but he says that's the next agenda. Shenemar v'hi achrei Moshe eved Hashem v'yomer Hashem v'goymer. As the pasuk in Yehoshua says. B'masnisa Tana, the Braisa tells us, Elef ushvameos kalin v'chamur nugzera shavos b'dikduke sofrim nishtakchu b'mei lo shel Moshe. And the Braisa tells us a very interesting thing. It tells us that there were 1,700 kal v'chomers that were forgotten, which are derivative laws that you draw out of the Torah based upon hermeneutic principles. There were also, part of those 1,700 were Gzera Shavas and Dikduke Sofrim that Rashi explains. These are things that were part of Torah Shebal Peh, that were lists of things, lists of halachos, like Chamesh Esrei Noshim in the beginning of Maseches Yevamos and things like that. So those were forgotten as well. And Omer Rabbi Avo Afal Pichein Hechziran Osniel ben Kenaz mitoch Pilpulo. Even though they were all forgotten, Osniel ben Kenaz, who was one of the Shoftim, was able to restore all of the things that were forgotten through Pilpul, through his great Talmudic skills. Shenemar vayilkada Osniel ben Kenaz achi kalev. It says that Osniel conquered a place called Kiryat Sefer. Now, Kiryat Sefer is a place in Israel today. It's a town. But Kiryat Sefer is also an allusion to the Sefer Torah. It says that Osniel ben Kenaz reconquered the Sefer Torah and was able to restore all questions. Now, if Osniel ben Kenaz was able to restore them, why couldn't Yehoshua restore them? So the simple understanding is because Osniel ben Kenaz did not restore them through prophecy. He restored them through Talmudic reasoning. So Talmudic reasoning is perfectly fine, yes. It's the thing that you cannot do is if you don't have the ability to create that Talmudic reasoning on your own, through logical arguments, you cannot consult with the Ribono Shel Olam and have him tell you the answer. You've got to come up with the answer yourself.
But how do you know which 3,000 you were missing?
The Gemara doesn't tell us. The Gemara doesn't tell us.
No, but you said you restored it all, so how did you know that?
I guess maybe these were the things that they had questions about. Some people had memorized the questions. We know there's a halacha X. We don't remember what the halacha is, but we know that it has to do with this. We know that it has to do with a certain situation in halacha. We don't know what the halacha is.
what kind of an answer is that if we don't know the halacha, we come to Kodesh Baruch and we say we don't know, to give the answer of Leich Chud Milchama. Now I wonder if that answer is actually the Milchamas of Torah. And
Could be.
And based on Knaz, Snil ben Knaz, it actually makes sense. So go, you figure it out.
Okay.
In other words, I can't give you the answer, but the Milchama is, you go in the Milchamas of the Beis Medrash, and because otherwise we do need to know them at some point.
That's a valid point. Although Asniel ben Kenaz is several generations after Yoshua.
Sure, right.
Yeah.
But this model is that,
Perhaps. Go and engage in the Milchamta Shel Torah. Okay, very good. The Maharsha says, trying to give us basic pshat. He says in source number 3, I'm just pulling out a couple of snippets from the Maharsha. Dahainu mishameis Moshe lo nitin l'shum navi l'chadesh min hashamayim. That no navi was given permission to innovate anything from heaven. Ela nitna l'chachamim im l'tamei im l'taher al pi harov. But what was given permission is that if there's a suffix in halacha, then Talmidei Chachamim can take a vote on it and deliberate based upon Talmudic reasoning. And then you go according to the majority of Chazal. If 51% say Tomei and 49% say Tohar, so then it's Tomei. And therefore he says, Umehai Taima Amrinin Ba'alma Dehachacham Adif Minavi. And that's why there's a famous saying in the Gemara that a Chacham is better than a Navi. Because a Navi cannot add to the halachic system, whereas a Talmud Chacham can. Okay, so that's the basic principle. I'm going to skip the Rambam for just a second. I want to take a look at the Brisker Rav. There's a very interesting commentary in source number 6. But before we understand what he says in source number 6, we have to take a look at source number 5. Source number 5 is also a famous Gemara in the very beginning of Maseches Megillah. And there the Gemara says, V'amar Rabbi Yirmiyah v'itema Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Menatzbach tzofim amrum. That the langa letters, what they call the osios, sophios, right? The end letters. So those end letters were instituted by the tzofim, which is another word for the prophets. They were the ones who taught them to us, and they were the ones who innovated that there are dual spellings to 5 of the letters of the alphabet. So the Gemara says, V'tispera. But can this really be so? V'hakesiv eila hamitzvos she'ein navi rashai lachadesh davar me'ata. But what about what we just learned? That a navi is not allowed to innovate anything at all. So the Gemara answers, V'od ha'amar Rav Chisda mem v'samach shebeluchos b'neis hayu omdim. And furthermore, don't we know that the letters mem sofit, and the letter samech, miraculously were suspended in the luchos. So you need to have a circular letter or a square letter that's bounded on all sides to appreciate the miracle, because the luchos were bored through all the way from one side to the other. And the only way that you could have a letter samech, which is a circle, is if the center of the letter O, or the letter samech, is suspended in midair. The stone that would fill it in is suspended in midair. And the same thing is true by the letter mem. Well, the letter mem that's in the middle of the word is not bounded on all sides. So that's not the miracle. What's the miracle? It's a mem sofit. It's a final mem. So you can't tell me that the Nevi'im created these final letters because they existed in the times of the Luchos, according to this tradition. Now, there are a lot of problems with this because, as we all know historically, the alphabet that existed at the times of Matan Torah is not the modern Ksav Ashuris that we have today, unless you subscribe to the Rambam, who says that it was. So we're going to put that aside for now. We'll just take the Gemara at face value. And the Gemara says that you see that there was a mem sofis in the times of the giving of the Torah. So the Gemara says in Mihava Havu V'lo Havu Yadu Hei Be'emtza Teva V'hei B'sov Teva V'asu Tzofim V'tzakinu Pesuchin Be'emtza Teva Ustumim B'sov Teva. So the Gemara says, you know something, you're right. Really, there were final letters. There were always dual spellings for the 5 letters that we have. However, what was is that people didn't know whether the final mem is the final mem and the regular mem is the regular mem. They didn't know. So can you use them interchangeably? Can you just indiscriminately put a mem sofit in the middle of a word? That's what they didn't know. And the Nevi'im came and told them, no, a regular mem goes in the middle or the beginning of a word, and a mem sofit goes at the end of the word. The Gemara says, but I don't understand. But you're still telling me that the Nevi'im innovated something that had not been halacha previously. Sof eila hamitzvah she'ein navi asiv lechadesh davar me'ata. But still, you're not answering the question, because a navi cannot innovate halacha. And if you're telling me that up until that time people had the option of doing whatever they wanted, and the Nevi'im changed the rule, so they're still changing. Okay, fine. They didn't create the letters, spellings, but at least they're creating the rules. So the Gemara says no. Ela shachachum v'chazru v'yisadum. What it really means is that really the halacha had been properly established from before. That the regular mem is at the beginning or middle of the word. The final mem is only at the end of the word. People forgot it, and people were starting to spell words incorrectly. The Nevi'im came and reminded people what the proper practice was. So this was not an institution of the Nevi'im. It was not an innovation of the Nevi'im. It was a restoration that the Nevi'im brought back something that had been previously forgotten. Now the question is, did they restore it through memory, through a Mesorah, or did they restore it through Nevuah? If they restored it through Nevuah, because it had been forgotten from all of the Jewish people, then aren't we back to our original problem? Because look at what happened in the Gemara in Temurah. In the Gemara in Temurah, what happens? Thousands of halachos are forgotten in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu. The people tell Yehoshua, get a Nevuah from Hashem to restore the halacha. Hashem says, I'm sorry, that's not the deal. I can't tell you things. Even the parts of Torah that were already given to Bnei Yisrael, once they're forgotten, they cannot be restored through Nevuah. So then what's the point of the Gemara saying that the Tzofim Yisadum, that the Tzofim instituted them? You have to say that what the Gemara means is that when the Nevi'im instituted them, they instituted them through a Mesorah that they had had with them, and not through Nevuah. Otherwise, it's still not answering the question. Is everyone clear? I mean, am I making myself clear on this issue? Yeah.
There's an internal contradiction, though, because how was the Torah scroll written at that time? If they didn't know it goes in the middle and the end, it was open to Sefer Torah.
So that's good. You should take a look at the Pnei Yoshua on this Gemara. It's a little bit misubach over here. The question is, there's a machlokus in the Gemara, I think it's a Gemara in Menachos, whether if you write a final mem in the middle of the word, is it b'di'evet kosher or not? So perhaps people thought that b'di'evet it doesn't make a difference, and so, So the question is, did they have to then passel the Sifrei Torah according to the opinion that it is passel? All right, that I don't know. So maybe Taka, that was the din. Maybe they had to passel all the Sifrei Torah based on the restoration of the Nevi'im. I don't know. Okay. Let's take a look at the Brisker Rav. The Brisker Rav raises a number of questions and answers very few of them. Okay, which is, unusual, but this is very confusing stuff. It raises a lot of issues. Okay, so the Gemara says. So of course he quotes the Gemara. We go to the second line, last word of the second line of where the Brisker Rav begins his commentary on the Gemara in Temurah that we just saw. He says, "V'hinei nira dehadin lo b'shamayim hi, v'hadin de'ein hanavi rashai lechadesh davar shnei dinim chalukim hein." He says, it would seem to me, the fact that the Gemara changes its language, first it talked about lo b'shamayim hi, and then it talked about eila hamitzvos, that a navi cannot innovate new halacha. So what's the difference? Why did the Gemara use both terminologies? And it went back and forth from one to the other. So he says that there are two different halachos, two different dinim. De bedavar shekvar nitan al yedei haTorah, ve'im nafal machlokes be'ezeh din, ein hashamayim yecholim lahachriyad. Halacha number one is that if the Torah halacha has already been given, Moshe Rabbeinu already taught this, but then people started to forget, and they don't remember what the din is. So in that situation, we say, no, Hashem can't restore the clarity. V'zehu sha'amru she'yishal mishamayim al ha'halacha she'nishtachchu ukvar nitnu mimoshe misinai. Al zeh ba'a hatshuva lo v'shamayim hi. And that's where they said to Yehoshua, go and ask. And Yehoshua said, I'm going to ask Hashem, but Hashem says no. Hashem says it's lo v'shamayim, even though I taught it already, but once you forget it, I can't bring it back. Once it's lost unless you use Talmudic reasoning. Aval al halacha chadasha, she'ein hanavi rashai lechadesh davar, but if there's a new case that was never taught ever at all, it was never even taught by Moshe Rabbeinu, so there a Navi also is not allowed to tell us what the halacha is. Lo lahosif v'lo ligroa v'lo l'shanos eza davar min haTorah. He's not allowed to add a new halacha. Even if he gets a communication from Hashem, that cannot be added and appended to the codex of the Torah. He can't tell us that there's a 614th mitzvah that was never taught by Moshe Rabbeinu. V'im kein hacha shelo shalu al halacha chadasha ki im masha nitan kvar im kein lo shayach hacha hada ein hanavi rashai lechadesh v'tzarach iyun. So therefore he says, I don't understand why when the Gemara talks about Shmuel, they ask Shmuel, it sounds from there that they were asking him about old halacha that they had forgotten. So then he says, I don't understand why the Gemara changed its verbiage. It really is the same thing as Yehoshua. But even though he's acknowledging the Brisker Rav that there are two issues, one is restoring that which was forgotten, and the other one is a Navi telling us a new halacha that had never been discussed before, and that's the difference between Lo Vashamayim and Eila HaMitzvos. He says, but it still doesn't fit so well into the Gemara, into the different people that are being asked the questions. So that's suffix number one that the Brisker Rav raises. Va'od tzarich bir. I have another difficulty. Bamesha amrulo sha'al halo hanavi eni yochol lishol dizehu rak madregas Moshe Rabbeinu imdu ve'eshma ma yitzaveh Hashem. He says, I don't understand, he says, how the Jewish people could go over to Yehoshua and to Shmuel, etc., and say, ask Hashem what the halacha is. Even if you are a Navi doesn't have that power. Only Moshe, the only Navi who had that power to initiate a conversation with God and to control the nature of the conversation was Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was able to go over to Hashem and say, excuse me, Ribbon Shalom, I have a shayla. Right? He says, Aval sha'ar ha'neviim ein lahem koach lishol ki im masha omrim lahem. He says, any other Navi that has ever lived throughout Jewish history has never had that liberty of approaching God and saying, Echaba Shaila, Echaba Kasha. That you don't find. So how could they ask anyone other than Moshe to go up and request a clarification from God? The only way to answer this question, he says, is that you'd have to say that they asked Yehoshua and Shmuel to clarify it by consulting the Urim V'Tumim. And there, so what is the Brisker Rav essentially saying? We know that the Urim V'Tumim were consulted regularly. But what the Gemara is therefore telling us is you consult them to determine whether to go out to war. You consult them to tell you whether you'll be successful in battle. But you cannot consult them about a halacha. You cannot consult them about halachic issues. That's not what the Urim V'Tumim is for. You can ask the Urim V'Tumim to clarify Metzias for you, but you cannot ask the Urim V'Tumim to paskin shaylos for you. Next, so that's difficulty number 2. Difficulty number 3 is Va'od Tzarich Biur. Dehalo Amrinan Da'osniel ben Kenaz Hechaziran. Im Kain Lamra Amr L'Shmuel Sha'al. Osniel ben Kenaz lives before Shmuel Hanavi, several generations. So if Osniel ben Kenaz was able to restore everything through his Talmudic logic, then why did they have to ask Shmuel to clarify the halacha that had already been restored by Osniel ben Kenaz? Be'efshir dahainu al ha'halacha shelo hechziram demasnisan tanan pachos migimel alafim halachos. So it could be that Shmuel was asking about the remainder of the halachos. Osniel ben Kenaz didn't really restore all 3,000. Maybe he only restored a couple thousand. And Shmuel still had left several hundred other sfeikos that he needed to ask about. Okay, that's a possibility. That's another difficulty. Now he says, let's look at another issue. He says, V'hinei b'sugya de menatzbach, going back to that Gemara in Megillah, the Amrinan v'ha ein hanavi rashai l'chadesh v'chulei u'mashani d'shachachum v'hadr v'chazru v'yisadum. He says that which the Gemara says that the Nevi'im, people had forgotten the rules of when to use the final mem and when to use the regular mem, and the Nevi'im came and clarified that issue. He says, "V'hinei tzarech lomar dahad dechazu v'yistu hu lo b'toras nevuah ki im b'toras beistin b'mido shehatorah nidreshes bahem." He says the only way to make any sense of this Gemara, as I spoke out just a moment ago, is that the Nevi'im, in order not to be Machadesh halacha through Nevuah, had to be Machadesh halacha through adjudication as a Beis Din, not as Nevi'im. That's the only way you can make sense of the Gemara. Otherwise, you're back to square one. You're back to your original question. And he says, if that's the case, fine. Amnam ayin Rashi Sukkah gabe arava shapirish Rashi dechazu v'yistam al pi hadibor ayin sham. We all know that the arava that we shake on Hoshana Rabbah is what the Gemara calls a minhag nevi'im. And Rashi there says its reason it's called the minhag nevi'im is not because it wasn't given to us halacha l'Moshe misinai. It was, but people forgot it, and the nevi'im restored the halacha. And there Rashi says they restored it al pi hanavua. So you see that nevuah is being invoked to restore a forgotten halacha. We're back to our original problem. So it's a kasha on Rashi. V'im kein tzarech iyun halo shuv kasha de'ein navi rishai lachadesh o lo v'shamayim. So we're back to our original question. Okay, I don't have an answer to the Brisker Rov's kashas. I wanted to raise them with you, but to demonstrate that it's very not clear the rules of the Gemara. If Rashi can say in Sukkah that the Arava practice was restored by the Nevi'im through Nevuah, so then we have a really serious problem. How can he say that in light of the Gemara, that a Navi cannot restore a halacha that was taught if he's going to restore it through Nevuah?
In Nevuah, we're talking about Nevuah from the Rebbeinu Shalom direct to the Navi.
Well, that's what Nevuah is. Nevuah, by definition, is receiving divine communication. Nevuah, if you're not receiving it from divine communication, then it's not Nevuah.
But if it's hand through Nevuah, but through second hand, through communication, let's say they got it through somebody that was in the past.
Then it's not Nevuah. Then it's a Mesorah. Okay.
Keep going. Anything that's different Nevi'im then would have these questions.
Correct.
That we have. I mean, now any
Well,
fundamental.
Right. Okay. So.
It also doesn't, in the Gemara, it says that they give the Elah mitzvot, right? Yes, they give Elah mitzvot to the Nevi for the letters.
It says.
Right? Avhaktiv Elah mitzvot.
Right. Right.
But isn't that what the Brisker Rav said was
for something new?
No, but if it was forgotten.
No, that's in the Havamina. That's in the Havamina.
No, what does it have? If it's Havamina, it says it's forgotten. If something's forgotten, then you can't. The answer to that is lo b'shamayim.
Correct. So
isn't this case forgotten?
At this point in the Gemara, at this point where the Gemara asks the question, "V'haksiv Elah hamitzvos," the Gemara thinks that it was innovated newly from the Nevi'im. If you go through that sugya, you'll see that.
Okay.
So, and then perhaps that's why the Gemara uses it at the end, sof Elah mitzvos, which is they're still innovating something because they're telling you when to use it at the end and when to use it in the middle. When that halacha.
That's forgotten.
No, that wasn't forgotten. That's what the Gemara's maskana is. The maskana is that it was forgotten. And if you tell me the Nevi'im restored it through Nevuah, so then you're back to the question of maybe, okay, fine, it's not a problem of Elah HaMitzvahs, but it's still a problem of Lo Vashamayim. Okay. How are we doing so far? So far, so good. Okay. I'm debating what to go over and what not to go over. I think it's important to take a look at the Rambam, because the Rambam adds a little bit of information here. We'll take a look at number 4. We won't have time to go through all of the data tonight, but it's a good start. Let's take a look at the Rambam. In Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah Perek Tes, we'll start with Halacha Aleph. Davar barur u'meforash b'Torah shehi mitzvah omedes la'olam u'la'olamei olamim. One thing is very clear and explicit in the Torah, that it is a mitzvah. Now, the word mitzvah in this context does not mean one single commandment, but that it is immutable. It is finite and static, okay? Forever and ever. Ein lo shinoi velo giraon. It is not subject to change or to detraction, velo tosefis, or addition. Shenamar eiskol hadavar asher anochi mitzaveh eschem oso tishmerun la'asos lo sosef alav velo sigra mimenu. As the Torah says explicitly, there's an isser of bal tosef and bal tigra, to add or subtract to the laws of the Torah. V'ne'amar v'haniglos lanu levanenu ad olam la'asos is called divrei HaTorah hazos. And it says that it is for us and our children to always do according to this Torah and not to change it at all. Halamadata shekol divrei Torah mitzuvin anu la'asosan ad olam. So the Torah that Moshe gave us is the Torah that applies for every generation. V'chein hu omer chukas olam l'doroseichem. And the Torah usually, many times uses this phrase, that this is an eternal statute. V'ne'amar lo v'shamayim. It says it's not subject to change by heaven. Halamadata she'enavi rashai l'chadesh davar me'ata. And therefore you know that a Navi cannot innovate a halacha anew. Now, you have to also read into this a polemic against Christianity and other religions that would try to say that the Torah has been altered at some point. Okay? So, lefichach im yamod ish bein min ha'umos bein mi Yisrael. Therefore, if anyone will come along, whether he be Jew or Gentile, v'yasa osu mofes, v'yomer sha'Hashem shalacho, lahosif mitzvah uligroa mitzvah, and he says that God sent him either to give us a new mitzvah or to tell us that this mitzvah no longer applies, or lefaresh b'mitzvah min ha'mitzvos pirush shelo shamanu mimoshe, or to explain a passage that is halachic in the Torah in a way that was not explained to us by Moshe Rabbeinu. O sha'omar sha'osan ha'mitzvah shenitztavu b'hen Yisrael einan la'olam u'l'dori doros ela mitzvos l'fi zman hayu, or if he tells us that the mitzvahs that Moshe taught to us do not apply for all generations. Like, the famous trichinosis for the pigs, right? That Moshe, they only applied back then, they don't apply today. Okay? Harei zen navi sheker. This is a false prophet. Shaharei bo lahakchish nevuaso shel Moshe, because he's coming to subvert and to contradict the prophecy of Moshe. Umisaso b'chenek al shehesa l'daber b'shem Hashem asher lo tzivo. Therefore, his punishment is the death penalty through strangulation. Shehu baruch shemot tziva l'Moshe sha'mitzvah hazos lanu levanenu ad olam v'lo ish kel v'chazev. Because if God says that this is a permanent law, and God is not a liar, he's making a liar out of God. Okay. Halacha beis, im kain. So this is the very important question. And how do you understand a passage that's in Parsha Shoftim? Lama nemar b'torah navi akim b'lahem b'kerav achayim kamocha. How can the Torah therefore say that I will send you a prophet, and you have to listen to whatever he tells you to do? Lo la'asos dasu ba, elo letzavos al divrei haTorah ulahazir ha'am shelo yavru aleha. So the Rambam tells us a very important principle. Whenever God sends a Navi, the Navi will never tell us to change the halachas of the Torah, but will rather be there to exhort us to observe the current laws and to warn us not to violate the current laws. Kemosha Amar ha'acharon shebahen zichru Toras Moshe Avdi, as one of the last prophets, Malachi, said, remember the Torah of Moshe, my servant. V'chein im tzivanu b'divrei harishus k'gon l'chu l'makom ploni o al telchu. And many times the Hashem will send a prophet to tell us to do an action which has nothing to do with halachic observance, such as go to so and such a place, or go to that place, or don't go. Asu milchama hayom olos asu, or like say, go out to war or don't go out to war. Benu chomazu o al tivnu, or build a wall or don't build a wall. Mitzvah lishma lo ve'haover al devar chayiv misa b'dei shamayim shem rabbi yisha shelo shema l'divrei naviyah sheidaber b'shmi anochi ad rosh me'ima. So in that situation, it's a mitzvah to listen to the Navi. The Rambam is basing himself on a Gemara in Yevamos. I did not copy the Gemara for you, but if you take a look at the Sforno in source number 9 in Parsha Shoftim, which is Perek Yud Ches Pasuk Tezvav, he says exactly the same thing. Elav tishma'un, you have to listen to a Navi that I will set up for you. And the Sforno says, Im yitzav mitzvahs sha'a. If he tells you to do something temporary in nature. Now, what does that mean if he tells you to do something temporary in nature? So it could be referring to what the Rambam is talking about over here. Or It could be if he tells you to do something on a very temporary basis, which is also what the Gemara allows for. So an example of that is Eliyahu on Har HaKarmel, where he told us to build bamos, even though those were not authorized. They were not permitted to be built according to the halacha of the Torah. And yet, since it was a hora shah, it was a temporary situation, he was not coming to tell us the halacha no longer applied. He said this is a special case. Then you're allowed to listen to the Navi.
We have other occasions of hora shah.
Right, so a Navi's allowed to do a hora shah as long as he clarifies that this is not the normative halacha. Okay. I made a mistake in the print. The next part of the Rambam is not halacha gimel, it's halacha dalet, so you may want to change that. Also, if a Navi tries to change even a halacha l'Moshe misinai or Torah sheba'al peh, something that we have through Masorah, or even if we know that there's a machlokus in the Mishnah, and a guy says, I had a nevuah that the halacha is like Reb Meir and not like Rabbi Yehuda, so harezen navi hasheker v'yechanek. He's a navi sheker. He's a false prophet. Put him to death. No one can tell you that they have a nevuah of such a nature. Afal pisha asa os, even though he performs a miracle. Shaharei balahakrish haTorah shamar lo v'ashamayim, because he's come to contradict the Torah, which says that it's not in heaven. But if it's a hora shah, if he tells you to do something that's only on a one-time basis or a very temporary basis, then you're allowed to listen to him. And that's corroborated by many of the poskim as well. Okay. We're gonna have to skip the Drashas Haran. We'll save that for another time. But I want to do the Kuzari with you, and just to be able to demonstrate that what the Rambam takes as a davar pashut is very, very not pashut. Everything that we've said until now is consistent. A Navi cannot create new halacha, cannot restore halacha that's been forgotten, and cannot even tell you how we paskin in halacha if he tells you he's getting this through divine communication because of lo vashamayim. Comes along, now we have Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, he lives before the Rambam. Their lives overlap only by 5 years. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi dies in 1140, the Rambam was born in 1135, so they probably never met. There's a question as to whether the Rambam had ever read the Kuzari. Many scholars believe that he did, but he just never acknowledged his knowledge of the Kuzari. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi writes in the third Maimer. Now it's important to know what the context of this statement is. The context of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's Maimer in the third essay of the Kuzari is to contradict the community that denies Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Karaite community. The Karaite community was a big challenge to Jews in the Middle Ages, especially in certain communities that were further south, in African communities and Southern European communities. The Karaites had gained a lot of ground, especially towards the 9th and 10th centuries and beyond that. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi devotes a whole section of his Sefer in the third Maimer to showing why Torah Sheba'al Peh is the correct interpretation of the Torah and how the Karaites are untenable in their belief system. And in the course of explaining that, he tells us how ironclad our Masorah is. Now remember, keep that in mind as far as the context of what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is saying. So the more that he can bolster the reliability of our Masorah, the better off he is in his argument against the Karaites. Okay? So let's take a look and see what he says. He says in the middle of section 39, starting with paragraph 4, he says, most of our commandments originate with Moshe, which he received at Mount Sinai. This also stands to reason. A nation which for 40 years was not burdened with food, clothing, or shelter, a nation which was very numerous and which had Moshe living with them and the divine presence constantly with them, if they were given the general rules of the commandments by Moshe, would they not inquire about the details and distinctions over the course of this time and duly transcribe them? We see that this occurred from the verse, I, Moshe, clarify for them the statutes of God and his teachings. Moshe also told them, through this you will be considered wise and understanding. But if all there is to the Torah is the written word, as the Karaites say, what wisdom and understanding is there? Meaning that when you look at the Torah and you see just the psukim that are there without any detailing of the halachos that are in the Torah, it doesn't sound like such a wise document. The Torah is only wise when you read in the details of the mitzvahs, and that's all part of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Only someone who would deny this passage can accept the teachings of the Karaites. But one who wishes to believe this passage will see the wisdom of the Mishnah and Talmud, which encompasses only a small portion of natural, metaphysical, mathematical, and astronomical science, which the sages studied, and will recognize that the Jews are truly worthy of taking pride amidst the other nations because of our superior wisdom. The remainder of our commandments originated from, now remember, that's the majority of the halacha that we have today. It's taught by Moshe Rabbeinu, who also taught us Torah Sheba'al Peh. Okay? The remainder of our commandments originated from the place which God shall choose. Asher Yivchar Hashem Elokecha, the place which God shall choose. When the aforementioned conditions of prophecy were satisfied. This prophecy continued into the Second Temple era for close to 40 years. In his prophecies, Yirmiyahu heavily praised the people of the Second Temple, extolling their saintliness, wisdom, and fear of God. If we could not rely on them, upon whom could we rely? So first he has to build up the reliability of the people that lived during the first Beis HaMikdash as being saintly and pious people, wise people. And therefore the prophets that lived during Bayis Rishon helped to continue the halachic process according to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. We can cite some examples of these post-Mosaic commandments. Shlomo instituted one when he sanctified the floor of the temple courtyard and offered sacrifices upon it without the altar. This is brought down Mefurish and Sefer Melachim. He also suspended fasting on Yom Kippur that year by making an inauguration festival of 7 days before Sukkot and 7 days of Sukkot. Now, is it a problem yet? Do we have a problem yet? Why not? Harasha. Okay, great. David and Shmuel organized the order of the Levites who sang in the temple as a permanent commandment. What do you say about that?
That's a
problem. He's saying that came through Nevuah. Shlomo built his temple using different...
What mitzvah is there?
Yeah.
A mitzvah of Shira.
You didn't have Shira before?
No. Shira did not exist in the Midbar.
But... so he's saying, but the way he phrases it, the order...
We don't find that it ever existed in the Midbar.
Oh, Rashi talks about that after the Levium turned 50, they were still they didn't carry the Kalim anymore, but they can still do Shira.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but that may be Rashi referring to in the Beis HaMikdash. You have to go back and take a look. But he's quoting the pasuk in Divrei Hayamim, which says actually that you have to take a look at the pasuk. It says there that they actually originated the Shira in the Beis HaMikdash.
The way he phrases it is organize the order of it. So is it like they sang before, and now we know who sings? We couldn't possibly know who's going to sing. They weren't even the Torah couldn't write about the order in advance.
Yeah, but we never find a commandment in the Torah for Levim to sing.
Most of them didn't exist, the Tehillim.
The Tehillim didn't exist, but there was no commandment bichlal to sing, even if they just wanted to hum a few bars, right? Right? There was no commandment, okay? So Shlomo built his temple using different dimensions from those of Moshe's Mishkan, and he built his own vessels instead of using the ones that Moshe had constructed in the desert. Is that a problem?
Not really. I mean, there's no. The only issur is only if you do it exactly the same.
You'd have to argue that Shlomo's dimensions were commensurate. There's a whole discussion about what right he had. If they're proportional, that's what the word I mean.
Says, right? The pasuk says only in that circumstance.
If they're proportional, and so how do you know that you can have a proportionate Beis HaMikdash? And what about different materials? The Mizbeach Nechoshes was made out of copper. He made it out of stone.
Kruvim.
What?
He built a second set of kruvim.
He built a second set of kruvim too. So it's not so pasha just to say that they were proportionate dimensions. Different materials, perhaps.
No, there's an answer. In other words, we're seeing how many of them you're going to get really stuck with.
Okay. Ezra levied a new temple tax on the community of an additional third of a shekel. Is that a problem?
I don't think so. Why?
No.
Is the assumption that Ezra on this asked the Kodesh, like, was it a nevuah?
Right. It could be that it wasn't a nevuah. It could just be.
Ezra decided.
It could just be they needed extra money. They need extra money. The Torah doesn't say that you can't levy an additional tax. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Because the shkulim were meant for the karbonos.
Okay.
And Ezra was not for the karbonos.
He wasn't doing it.
The money itself didn't go specially to the karbonos, which were meant.
Right. He did it for the better kabayas also. Right. Yeah. Okay. They also placed a stone in the place where the ark had been in the first temple, and they hung a dividing curtain in front of it because they knew that the ark was hidden in that spot. This is already now going to the. This is for the second Beis HaMikdash. So the Kuzari asks in paragraph number 40, how can it be if the Torah commands lo sosef alav v'lo sigra mimenu, you're not allowed to add or subtract from the Torah? So obviously Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is aware of this prohibition that the Rambam has taught us, right? That a Navi is not allowed to be machadesh anything. So how could they do it? So listen to his answer. The rabbi said, this was said to the masses, so that they would not innovate based on their own intellects or philosophize based on their own thoughts or establish laws for themselves based on their own reasoning, which is what the Karaites do. Prophets, on the other hand, echo God's will when they ordain new commandments. The Torah therefore commands us to heed the prophets that will arise after Moshe, as well as the Kohanim and judges, as it says, Navi mikir b'cha me'achecha kamoni. That here, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi uses the very same pasuk that the Rambam says is not for halachic purposes. He says the Torah similarly states that the Kohanim and the judges must be heeded. So he's saying that the Navi has to be listened to just like the Shoftim and the Beis Din. So he's clearly not agreeing with the Rambam. Okay? When the Torah says, do not add to the law which I command you, it means that you may not add or subtract from what I've commanded you via Moshe and via the prophet from your midst, using the prescribed criteria to verify the prophet and the prophecy. Nor may you digress from those laws which are agreed upon by the Kohanim and the judges who convene at the place which God shall choose. This is because they are aided by the divine presence. Furthermore, because there are so many of them, it is not possible that they will arrive at a consensus which is contrary to the Torah. They will not collectively err in their judgment because of their vast wisdom. They acquired this wisdom partially through inheritance from their forefathers, partially through their innate proficiencies, and partially through their endeavors to acquire wisdom. He's referring now to the Sanhedrin. We thus have a tradition that the Sanhedrin was commanded to master all areas of knowledge, and the fact that prophecy and its later lesser manifestations, such as the heavenly Baskol, were constantly with them, is all the more reason to lend them credence. Them here in this paragraph referring to the Sanhedrin. But in the previous paragraph, he certainly lumps the Nevi'im together with the Sanhedrin. Just like the Sanhedrin can teach you new halachas based on wisdom, so to the Nevi'im can teach you new halacha based on Nevuah. So what is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi going to do with our Gemara in Temura? I don't have a teretz yet. Take a look at the Kol Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda Moscato on that Gemara. We're not going to look at that tonight. But I want to leave you with a cliffhanger. It's a kasha on Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. It's a kasha on the Kuzari. And we're going to try to be miyashiv it, Mir Hashem, next time.